Okay. Okay, so good morning, everyone from Vietnam, and good afternoon or evening, everyone from US. So, welcome to all of you to the Viet TPLT Public Workshop Series 2025. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am Trung Nguyen. I'm the director of Vietnamese language program at the Columbia. And today, join with me, I have my one of my co-founders, or like my colleague is An Sake from Arizona State University. And we have the guest speaker, Catherine Baumann. So first of all, I would like to tell something about the Viet TPLT Public Workshop Series 2025. So it is a professional development initiative that designed to support the language educator, curriculum developer, and researchers interested in task-based language teaching in Vietnamese and beyond. This year, our series focused on practical application, classroom innovation, and curriculum alignment, grounding in the real-world task and communicative purpose. We are honored to bring in experts from around the world to share their knowledge and connecting with our growing community of educators. And for this series, we received the fund from the National LCTR Resources Center, a Title VI Language Resources Center from the U.S. Department of Education. However, the content of this workshop do not necessarily represent the NLC or the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So that is the first thing I would like to briefly, very quickly about the Viet TPLT, and as well as our public workshop series. You can, if you want to know more about us, you can find us from the website. And today I want to introduce the first workshop in this series. We thrilled to welcome Dr. Catherine Baumann. She's a senior instructional professor and director of the University of Chicago Language Center, where she worked to reframe the language instruction at the 21st century scale. She received her Ph.D. in second languages and culture education at the University of Minnesota, specializing in reading comprehension and language testing. She oversees own program in CLC and consult for the language programs in higher education on a variety of curricular and assessment related issues. And her talk today with the title Aligning Curriculum and Task-Based Materials will guide us through the strategy to ensure the coherence between what we teach, how we teach it, and what we expect the learner to do with the language. Before joining me with welcome Dr. Catherine Baumann, I would go very quickly the agenda for today. We have 30 minutes for her presentation, and then we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. You are welcome to type your questions in the chat at any time during the talk, or unmute yourself to ask directly during the Q&A session. And now, I would like to welcome Dr. Catherine Baumann.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I love seeing it's a terrific group, very diverse group. I'm going to share my screen. Chung, is that okay to share my slides? Yeah.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay. Okay, so, all right. It's wonderful to be here with everyone, and good morning and good evening, I would say. I'm going to start a little bit theoretically, think a little bit meta about curriculum, and then I'll introduce some principles behind task-based language teaching, and although I know you're going to have other workshops about that, then look at some examples. And then I'm going to be viewing all of this through the lens of reverse design, because I think that's really the key to this idea of alignment and deciding when and how to use task-based materials or activities, and how to design them for what purposes. So I first want to start with, how we think about how do we think about our curricula, right? Um, as a whole, in general, just the whole idea of our curriculum, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, or how we think about designing a syllabus or thinking about designing a course, right? Or even how we think about a day's lesson. And we bring so many strategies, we bring beliefs, we bring perceptions about methods and approaches. There are many new techniques and activities. Right now, you're all learning about the focusing really on the task-based approach or task-based strategies. So when you're learning something new about curricula or a new aspect of it, it can really deepen your knowledge base. So you're going to have that opportunity now. And that gives you a moment to think, how does this fit into my teaching in general? Many people here are very, very experienced teaching, or how to make decisions about how to use it, when to use it, how it's going to serve your curriculum. So I think, or how this will be optimal in even a given lesson. So it's a moment to really think about this in the context of everything else you're doing. And it's kind of a big question mark, right? How to do that, how to effectively do that. So I want to introduce the concept of reverse design as an approach. And many of you that are in this workshop know about the work we've done in Chicago using reverse design as a framework. And when I do this, I like to pose this question to this group, and you can put your answer in the chat. If I ask this group, what is the best way to get there? Should I take a bus or should I take an Uber? What do you think? I'm guessing there aren't going to be many answers in the chat. And why can't you tell me the best way to get there, or whether I should take an Uber or a bus or walk? Because you don't know where I'm going. And that's the very, very basic idea behind reverse design. If you know where you are going, you can make better decisions about how to get there, right? You can make better choices. You can make deliberate, intentional choices. Just that little example, in a way, teaches us that. And if you know where you're going and you can make better decisions, you'll probably be more likely to actually get there. So this is a reverse design model that we've developed at the University of Chicago in the work we've done with many, many less commonly taught languages, including a big, big group of South Asian language instructors. And it is a reverse design approach that's also very much informed by um, assessment. So the first piece of our reverse design approach is that we are teaching our learners to use language in the real world. In other words, I'm not just teaching first year Vietnamese so they'll take second year Vietnamese. Of course, we want them to keep taking Vietnamese, but I think we need to say to our learners, you're learning Vietnamese, and the way I'm teaching it will let you use this language in the real world. And at least in the United States, this is what students want to hear. They want to hear that the things they're learning in college are going to be useful for them when they leave college in the real world. So we start with this, what we call the target language use domain. Where are the learners going to use the language in the real world? What are they going to do with it? So in order to talk about that, we then need what's called the construct. And that is, wait, I have to advance these slides. We go now backwards. So we use the ACTFL guidelines to identify actions or behaviors showing skills or knowledge. In other words, how do we describe what the learner can do or what the learner knows and how well they can do those things? We use the ACTFL guidelines. You can also use the Common European Framework, and I'll give some examples with both of those. So we say we're teaching so that they can use language in the real world. How do we talk about how well they can do that? We're going to use existing guidelines or the Common European Frame as a reference. So that's the next step. Then we make a test, because we have to test and see, are they doing it? Are they able to do it at the end of first year Vietnamese or at the end of second year Vietnamese? So we take this description from the guidelines, or the Common European Framework and make a test because we want to find out if our teaching is actually reaching those outcomes. And then with all of that in place, we turn to the curriculum, which is, of course, the focus of this workshop. And if we know our outcomes, some level of the guidelines or a level of the Common European Framework, and we know how we're going to test them, we can make better choices about how to teach. All right. So this workshop is really about curriculum, about using task-based activities and materials in your curriculum. And but when you think about that, the decisions you make about your curriculum are informed about your outcomes defined by the ACFL guidelines and the way you're going to teach them. So you want to keep that in mind all the time. All right, now I want to get to some definitions. So this is a definition of task. In the task, when students are engaged in a task, the primary focus is on meaning. They're definitely using language, they're using grammar, they're using vocabulary, but they're very much focused on the meaning. And there's some kind of gap that where they need to convey information, express an opinion, make a decision, and they have to use language to do that. They rely on linguistic knowledge, but they also rely on non-linguistic knowledge. That could be things they know about the world, or things they know about a topic, or things they know about how to exchange information. And there's a very clearly defined outcome, not just using language, but producing some kind of outcome. And I'll share some examples. So if you think about a like a grammar exercise that's communicative, that very often is fills number 2 and number 3, but not 1 and 4. So a task has to have all 4 of these elements in it. Okay, here are 7 principles from Noonan for task-based language learning. First of all, scaffolding. The lessons and materials give the students a framework where the learning takes place. It's very structured and scaffolded. Task dependency. This is really the key to the whole thing. Every task builds upon the one before it. So every step in your activity is providing them with some language or some material that they can use for the next step. Next is recycling. You keep recycling the same language, whether it's vocabulary or grammar, asking questions, whatever it might be, keeps being recycled throughout the entire task to give lots of opportunities for students to use it. Fourth is active learning. They're actively using language. This is not a drill. This is not repetition. This is not memorization. This is active language use. It also integrates the idea of what they know about linguistic forms and how they can use those linguistic forms to communicate and make meaning. So it kind of brings that all together for the learner. And then you go from reproducing language, maybe language that was their homework or language that they just practiced with you in class, to creating with it and really using it in a brand new creative way that they haven't used it before. And finally, finally, the last part is reflection. Sometimes you might say to the learners, you might use this language, just what we did in class, in a market when you go to Vietnam, or this is exactly the kind of conversation you might have with your host family if you're a student when you're studying abroad. So you kind of give them a moment to think about what they're doing, what they're learning, and how they could use it. So I'm going to kind of review these principles again with some of these activities. So the first example I want to give you is an information gap activity. Some of you may use these. You may be familiar with them. Basically, you have 2 different worksheets, and one student has A, one student has B, and student A needs the information student B has, and student B needs the information that student A has. It's these are very simple to set up, and very often, so students are going back and forth asking about Marie and Albert's eating habits, and then at the end, they're going to ask their partner about their own eating habits. You provide students the language they need to do this activity, to fill out the gap, and also to ask each other these questions. All right. So information gap activities are a really nice example of a very simple task. All right. It fits all of the criteria that I just shared with you about task-based activity. In terms of scaffolding, they have all the language they need to do this task. So, and another tenet about tasks is that because they're scaffolded, it lets the students do more with language than they actually could if you didn't scaffold it. If you didn't provide them with these works, if you had the students sit down and you said, ask each other about your eating habits, there'd be total silence in the room. But because you scaffolded this in this task, you give them all the language they need to do. They have the questions, they have the answers, and then they can recycle this language to ask their partner. You can see how each step helps them do the next step. That's the task dependency. After asking about Marie and Alex's habits, when my partner says, "What do you like to eat?" I can use this same language to answer that question if I want to. The language is also recycled again and again. That's another element of the task-based principles. It's very active. Students are communicating, and also remember they're talking and listening and writing and reading. So they're using all four skills to do this activity. Really great depth of processing. It's also very integrated. You have the vocabulary, you have the questions, so it makes it possible for them to have a simple conversation. It goes from the idea of reproduction, so they're just reproducing this language that they're reading, to creation. Now it's my turn to respond um, individually. And then you can tell learners, especially if at the end you ask them to report on their partner's eating habits, this is language you can use in the real world. You're able to talk about your eating habits, talk about someone else's eating habits. So again, this is a very, very simple example. Now, if you do an information gap activity like this one, let's go back to think about reverse design. So what goals and outcomes whoop, does this information gap on food likes and dislikes serve? What is this helping your learners be able to do in the real world? Just think for a minute and you can put answers in the chat. So what real world speaking skills does that activity help them develop? Just think for a minute. Okay, I'm going to shoot some of them in because time is a little tight. So first of all, asking questions. It gives them practice asking questions. Practicing food vocabulary is another one. Answering with one or two words, because if you say, what does Albert like to eat? You just might give the one word answer, and that's okay. Answering questions in a very simple way. It's another skill they're practicing. Talking about eating habits is another skill they're developing. And speaking in full sentences, because at the end, if I have to tell you about An's eating habits, because she was my partner, I'm going to have to use a bunch of loosely connected sentences to do that. So it's really helping me speak at that level. So what proficiency level does this correspond to? All right, on the ACTFL scale, it's intermediate speaking, creating with language, especially when I ask my own partner, what do you like to eat? What don't you like to eat? Carrying on a simple conversation, asking questions, answering questions, getting through a simple transaction, producing some strings of discrete sentences about a personal everyday topic, and then there's your accuracy requirement. So this very simple activity is supporting this as an outcome, intermediate speaking. And if you're using the Common European Framework, you can see, if you read the description for A1 and A2 for spoken interaction, information gap is another great activity to use for your learners if your goal is A1 or A2 in spoken interaction. Okay. So that example is a flip-flop of reverse design because I started with the activity and then thought about the outcomes. So now I'm going to go and do real reverse design, and the way to think about using reverse design to help you think about some other task-based activities. Okay, so let's say these are my outcomes for second year Vietnamese. Intermediate reading. All right, at the end of that year, I want students performing at the intermediate level. And here's a description of what readers can do at, at the intermediate level. Basic information simply, strings of discrete sentences, idea units, daily life topics, familiar genres, text and context, understanding the overall meaning, even though they don't know every word. If you're using Cepher, here's their A1, A2 reading. This might also be your goal. So again, remember in the reverse design model, you have an outcome in mind. You know where you're trying to get your students at the end of a year. Okay, that's your goal. That's your destination. So how might you construct a task-based activity to get them there? All right, and what I'm really trying to introduce and drive home right now in this workshop is having your outcomes in place before you think about lesson planning. And having outcomes, end of first year, end of second year outcomes, having those in your head, having them stated explicitly before you try to implement task-based activities into your curriculum, because you've got to make choices in how those are designed. And you're going to be able to make better choices if you know your destination, if you know where you're trying to get your learners. So let's say this is my outcome for my end of my curriculum in reading. And here's that reverse design model again, right? Okay, so my intermediate mid reading or intermediate reading, what kind of curricular choices am I going to make? Okay, so first thing you have to do, of course, you have to choose materials. And knowing your outcomes in advance will also help you choose materials. So if you look at this material, look at this, this is a menu. Does this menu meet the criteria for intermediate, mid, or intermediate reading? All right, it has some sentences, idea units, familiar contexts. All right, it's a good context. Students are familiar with menus. So I'm going to say yes, this is going to let me do some good activities that will give my students practice with skills to get them to comprehend reading at the intermediate level. All right, so picking material, of course, is one step. These are some other principles of task-based activities. You have a desired outcome. You know what you want to happen in your class. You break that down into sub-steps or subtopics. You sequence concrete tasks, and each concrete component is meaningful for the next step. Remember, that's the principle of this task dependency. Each one builds on the one before it. Okay, so let's look at a lesson using that input, this one. Al Bawadi Grill, a very good Persian restaurant in Chicago, by the way. All right, so here's my task-based activity, Al Bawadi Grill. This could be like not getting to the intermediate low level. So first of all, for homework, I'd have my students scan the menu and list all the food words they can find. Just make a big list of all the food words. And then I'd ask them to read it again, and I'd have some true false questions that would be self-scoring online. This is just because I want them to do some reading on their own before they come to class and be ready to work with that text, with that little menu. Now they're in class, face to face. And let's say This is the goal of my lesson, to have a class discussion. What is the best dish on the menu? Now, if I walk into class after they've done their homework, and I know they've all read the menu because I have all their homework, and I say, okay, class, let's have a discussion. What is the best dish on the menu? What's going to happen? When I used to teach German, there would be total silence. Or maybe there'd be one student who'd raise their hand. Okay? So the principle behind task-based teaching is that this is my goal for the class, having a discussion of what's the best dish on the menu. But I don't start there. I go step by step and lead my students there. Okay? So here's how I'm going to do that. So, first of all, step one, I'm going to have them work with a partner and categorize the vocabulary into three. Put all the words into, take all the words you brought from the homework, make a list of all the meat words, make a list of all the vegetable words, make a list of all the side dishes. Okay, so I have them do something with the vocabulary. Next, with the same partner, do a little activity where you describe a dish to your partner until they can guess which one it is. And I'm going to give them the language. The dish has, the dish doesn't have, the dish costs more, the dish costs less, the dish is, the dish isn't. Okay. So by giving them this language, this is scaffolding now, I let them do more than they could if they didn't have that. Okay, that's my second activity. Next, find a new partner and interview them about Al-Bawadi menu. What do you like? Why? What dish don't you like? Why? Which is the healthiest? Which is the unhealthiest? So all the language they did in step two, they can use to do step three. So this is this task dependency. See how that works? By having them first warm up the vocabulary and then do this little activity where they're describing dishes to each other, that's going to help them interview their partner. Okay. And then I want them to tell me, I want them to, each one to tell me about their partner. So I would say, well, Chung really liked the vegetarian skewer because she loves vegetables. She doesn't like something, something because this. So now I'm having them report on their partner, and you can have other students listening ask questions. Why doesn't she like meat? Or why does she like vegetables? The next step would be, with your partner, decide what is the best dish on the menu, and you must come to an agreement. So all the language we've done in steps 1, 2, and 3 will make it possible for the partners to choose the best dish on the menu. And after we've done all this work, now we'll have our class discussion. So now everyone's ready to have a discussion because in their partners, they have already come to a conclusion and they have a lot of language to use, and this discussion will be a much better and richer activity. All right. And I hope you can see this lesson plan has all of the qualities of a task-based activity, right? I couldn't start at the end. Instead, I have to scaffold it step by step to bring my learners to that point. Every task makes the task after it better and richer. It makes it possible for that to be better. The language is recycled again and again. We're using the same language over and over in slightly different tasks, so we recycle it. It's very active. It goes from sort of simple language to more open-ended language to much more open-ended in the discussion. So little by little, we're moving also from this idea of repeating language to being active with language. And we move from, text-based to more open-ended speaking activities. Okay. All right, here's another example. Let's say these are my outcomes for speaking. This is intermediate speaking again. And then spoken interaction, A1 and A2. So at the end of 1 year or 2 years of instruction, those are my outcomes. And this is also the intermediate writing. And SEFR writing a little higher, A2 and B1. Okay. So again, I have these outcomes in my mind, and I'm trying to think of activities that are going to bring my students to these outcomes, that are going to give them the kind of practice that let them reach these outcomes. How do I design that? What am I focusing on? What needs to happen in these activities? So I'm not just creating task-based activities, I'm creating task-based activities and choosing materials because I know what my outcomes are at the end of a year of instruction or 2 years of instruction. Okay, and here's my reverse design again, right? So those two, reading and writing, or speaking and writing, that's my construct. Those are my descriptions of the outcomes. Now, what do I do in terms of curriculum to help my students get there? That's the curricular piece. Okay, let's say my grammar homework was high frequency verbs around free time activities and other activities. So this is what they're working on for homework. And I want to have a class discussion. Is our class active or inactive? Sedentary, do they like to sit around a lot, or active? And then I'm also going to give them a writing assignment to write a blog post about American students and their free time activities. What do they do? Are they active or not? Okay, now again, if I would come into class and try to do this discussion, not a lot of language is going to happen. Okay? So I have to structure a lesson that's going to make that happen, to bring them step by step to this discussion, and also so that based on this discussion, they can write a nice blog post using all the language that got generated in class. So how am I going to structure that? All right. So there's their homework. They're coming in with this language practiced. Okay, so first of all, I'll have students come up to the front of the room and pick out a card that has one of the verbs on it, like, I don't know, dancing, and they act it out until the others guess what they're doing. So that's a way to refresh and practice the vocabulary. Step 2, work with a partner. Decide whether each activity is sedentary or active, and you have to agree. So I'm going to walk through this list with my partner. What do you think? Dancing at a party, sedentary or active? Riding a bike? And we're going to mark them back and forth. It lets us also use the vocabulary in a very easy, simple way. Next, add 3 new activities that you do and decide if they're sedentary active. So this lets my learners bring in language that they know and add it to the vocabulary list. Next, I'm going to interview my partner using the list above. So I would say, do you play a sport? Yes or no. Do you read? Yes or no. Do you post online? Do you cook? I'm gonna interview my partner, and they're gonna interview me, and we're gonna keep track of our answers. So I'll be writing now about my partner. She reads books, she dances, she cooks, she doesn't do sports, she doesn't ride a bike. All right. Now we're each gonna look at our partners' responses, and then we're going to rate our partner on a continuum on the board. So the teacher has a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very active is over here. Kind of medium is in the middle, very sedentary. So I'm going to come up to the board and I'm going to write Trong's name here. She's very sedentary because she just likes to read and play video games and watch movies. So she's not very active. And then everyone's going to put their partner somewhere on this continuum and say a few sentences about why they're there. So again, you can see how the language step by step is letting them take part in each one of these steps. Now we'll have our class discussion. Everyone's ready to talk about or vote on whether our class is active or not by using all the language in the previous steps. And they would also be ready to do the writing assignment using all the language we've generated in class. And I think too, you can see how this activity is helping my students gain intermediate speaking skills because they're speaking at the intermediate level and create a very nice intermediate writing text, a blog, using all the language generated in class. And by the way, having students use language generated in class to do a writing assignment is a way to get around the AI problem. Because they can't feed this into AI. They've got to use language that was generated in class. And you can also tell them that at the beginning of class. All right. So these kinds of activities are in alignment with my outcomes, but also giving my students this kind of maximum opportunity to use language and to get, and that's where I'm accountable to getting them where they need to be. So again, you're now in this set of workshops, gaining more skills, either being introduced to task-based activities or getting deeper knowledge about task-based learning, task-based activities. It's still up to you to choose them, to design them to meet the goals of your curriculum. That's where you are really in charge. The design of task-based activities, and I'm not an expert on that, but I think, my role here has been to get you thinking about which ones are going to serve my outcomes, which ones are going to fit into my curriculum, where and when, especially having those targeted outcomes in mind will help you decide on the optimal integration, the optimal materials to use, and optimally make sure that your students are going to reach those outcomes. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. And we have, I think, time for questions. I'm going to go out of this. And I will share these slides. You're welcome. I'll share these slides with you, Chung, and you can obviously share them with everyone at the workshop that's been here.
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So thank you so much, K3, for the very insightful and inspiring presentation about the curricular and with the task-based material. And now we have time for the Q&A session. So please feel free to unmute yourself to ask question, or if you want, we can type in the chat. And then we will have about like 20 minutes to address as many as question as we can. Okay, so like while waiting for everyone can be type the question in the chat or like to unmute by themselves, I can start with my first, okay, on my own. Yeah, so I've been integrating the TPLT into my program at the Columbia for the past 3 years, and also have been actively involved in the designing and developing the task-based materials over the last 2 years. Especially last year, we done with the intermediate levels textbook, and then we based on the task-based. And when we go through this work, I've noticed some important benefits that why I should apply the TPLT in my curriculum, as well as I also see the challenges. So first of all, I want to say that I can see that the task-based approach significantly enhance my student interaction. like
Yeah.
both in the classroom and beyond, especially for the scaffolding, that when
Yeah.
we ask students to do the pre-face-to-face activities, and then we follows like step by step, like the task, the task independent, as well as the last one, like on the step, like you just like introduce to us. And then
Mm-hmm.
the student love to do the real world tasks, because
Yep.
like they can apply right away after the class. For example, this summer I have some students from my first year. They travel to Vietnam with
Wow.
family, and they starting to like book the tour and then talk with the guide during their
Mm-hmm.
trip. So that is the thing that is very motivate and engage for the student. But I think that that is the benefit, but also have some challenges that I also met when I do this. The first, I think, is also my reflection, but also I think it's some question for you. That the first thing about the materials, that how can teachers effectively work with the pre-existing textbook or curricula that are not inherited task-based,
Mm-hmm.
especially when the time is limited, and then we cannot like the instructor cannot like to develop the new material from the scratch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
that is
is the
that is
first question.
yeah.
Yeah.
That is challenging. I mean, I guess that goes back to deciding what it is you're going to have your learners do for homework and what you're going to spend face-to-face time on. And if there are things in a book that are well done and useful, but if students can do them on their own, that can be something that's happening pre-face-to-face. So you can spend time in class having them interact. Because, really, like those little lessons and activities I showed you, they can't do those on their
Mm.
own when they're not face-to-face. That can only happen with you and their classmates in class. So it's really, I think, deciding how you're going to spend face-to-face time and in a way, teaching your students, okay, this is why I'm having you do that on your own, so we can do this together and
Yes.
you can really use language. And there's a question in the chat about students who are resistant. I think we have to teach students that if language is just not knowing language, language is using language, and really teach them the difference. And many of our students have learned to play a musical instrument or they've learned a sport, and you can tell them the difference between knowing music or learning the rules of the sport are not the same as using that to become good at the sport or good at playing the musical instrument. And that's what your job to do in the classroom. So um, I think you have to sort of it's like the co-constructing how you're spending your class time. So, and telling them why you're doing it that way. There's
Yeah, we have
another question. Yeah.
question.
You don't have to, okay, so I think you have to, yeah, if you want to stay in the target language, this is a question about switching to complete the task. You just have to tell the students, no, you're only using the target language. There's no use, in our context, in the United States, when I was teaching German, no German, right? I mean, no English, you're only using German. But I think you can see in those scaffolded steps, they have all the language they need. Because it's scaffolded and you're providing them what they need at each step in order to prepare them for the last most open-ended, there's not much need for them to not use the target language because they really do have what they need. That's kind of on you to scaffold it. Chung was talking about that too. The scaffolding really, really keeps them engaged. You're kind of giving them the gas they need to do what it is they need to do. Yeah, Claudia Fernandez, nice to see you. Um, yeah, so I think she's asking the big a blog about the class. This I would want them to be doing this at the intermediate level. This is an intermediate class. This is not going to be like an advanced level actual structured blog. So it might be maybe blog is the wrong task to learn. Maybe it's more about a you're living wherever, learning the language, and you're writing about your experiences in an online diary or something, and you write about eating habits of your peers. So not so fixed on the genre as giving them a writing task that where they would somehow have to incorporate that. There's another,
Yeah, another question from Chang Fan.
yeah. Did I miss one? Okay. Okay, this question about, so information gap to be at the advanced level, that's pretty challenging, right? Information gap is usually at the simple sentence, a few sentences. Um, to do this kind of these kinds of language functions you're talking about, you're really talking about doing structuring beyond the information gap. You're really talking about a structuring a task, a class discussion, having them taking on a bigger topic than the ones I shared with you, I will send you, and I'll make a note of it, Chung, another sort of step-by-step task for comparing multiculturalism and multilingualism. And that's a
Yes.
more complex topic, and show how you would get them there. Um, but the but the but the things you're talking about, negotiation shifts, you'd have to really structure that you'd have to tell them exactly what to do in their small group discussion to make them practice those things, right? That's a whole other workshop on small group, like role interdependence or task interdependence. You can do it, but it takes a really high structure. Okay, there's another question somewhere that I missed.
No, I think that. So if you want to have the directly question to Kathy, you can unmute and ask instead of
Yeah.
you typing.
Yeah, they can
You
just
can
ask.
just like raise your hand. Yeah, you just raise your hand and then you can ask.
Yeah. I have
Okay, we
one
have one
question.
more.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I have one question that is written in the chat, but I
Yes,
can
I'm reading it, Chang. Yeah.
yeah. So most of my students are heritage learners who their main purpose to learn Vietnamese is to communicate with their family members. However, their family members Vietnamese is Southern dialects and the language that were brought to the US after the Vietnam War, kind of like the bubble, and it's not modern or news the Vietnamese used in
Yeah.
Vietnam. And if we are using the authentic videos or article in Vietnam, which are mostly written or made with the northern dialects, different
Yeah.
from student familiar dialect, sometimes cause student confused. And also
Right.
some
Right.
questioning about that. My question is, what should be the best approach to tackle the gap between the student needs and the availability of the good quality authentic material that I can find online?
Yeah, that is
And
a great question, because I'm trying to think of how you could find it's not possible to find materials in that Southern dialect.
we can find, but because the national televisions
Yeah.
are
Oh,
usually
yeah.
speaking in northern dialects.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, that's a tricky one. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say have them interview their family members and use those as listening inputs. I don't know, because, you've almost got like a diglossia going on here. You've got the language that people are hanging on to as immigrants right here. And then you've got what's happening in Vietnam. I think it's really great for you to ask this question, because you're showing that you're aware of what students are facing, and trying to meet their needs, and maybe also preparing them to be in Vietnam. So um, I don't know if it would be possible to have them actually create recordings with family members or community members about current topics that you could then use as listening inputs. You're probably not going to find quote unquote authentic things in those dialects, right? But I mean, people talking about their lives, that's authentic also, right?
Yeah.
That's challenge. Oh, the heritage piece is so challenging. That's a great
Yeah.
question, right? Wow.
Yeah, we have another question from Juan.
Yeah. Right. So is this because someone else is in charge of the curriculum? This is yeah. So I was at a task-based teaching symposium that was 2 years ago as part of our Chicago Language Symposium. We share a workshop between DePaul, University of Illinois, University of Chicago, Northwestern, and 2 years ago it was on task-based teaching. And one thing I asked is whether, because I see some people seeing task-based teaching as a method, I see it as a technique, a really fantastic technique for getting students to interact, to scaffold materials, to scaffold activities. The speaker who was the keynote said, there are two schools of thought. So I don't think it has to be as rigid as a method where you have to go to your department and ask to use a new method, or go to your supervisor, whoever it is. I think it can be used as a technique to scaffold and structure class discussions. And I know I've had a lot of conversations about that with when I was working in the German program, and I would have graduate students teaching, and they'd come to me and they'd say, I'm trying to have a class discussion and it's silent. And I'd say, okay, stop. What is your goal of the discussion? Let's back it up and do multiple scaffolded steps to bring them and give them the language and practice they need to have the discussion. I think that's the real strength of these activities. Chung, I don't know, are you using it as a method, or are you using it as a technique as part of your curriculum?
I think I use both.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think for my Vietnamese intermediate level, I use for the whole textbook based on the task-based materials, and then I
Mhm.
follow like exactly I combine with the curriculum that what I learned from Chicago, that I do the also face-to-face and face-to-face and posting. So I think
Yeah.
that I combine for both of this. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's like exactly the answer I would hope to get, is that everyone in this workshop, you know your language, you know your curriculum, you know your students, you're within a department, and you're learning about new things all the time. It's up to you to choose them and decide how to use them and when to meet your goals. That's where you are in charge, right? And that's what I really, as Chung just said, I'm doing both, because that's what works for me in my setting to reach my curricular goals. So whenever you're confronted with a new technique, method, approach, you're always thinking in the context of my program, of my curriculum, like big picture curriculum, what will work? How can I adapt this? How do I choose this? How do I design this to meet the goals of my curriculum? And when I say those goals, I'm talking about those proficiency outcomes, most ideally. I mean, there are other goals, knowledge about culture, right? There are other goals as well, but you're really the boss of how this gets best implemented. You're really bringing that expertise.
Yeah, so I have one follow-up question for the materials, about the authentic materials. For example, like Chang just say about the one chances for the Vietnamese is like heritage student is mean the dialect between the northern and southerns. But also another question I see that from myself, also from other instructors, when we try to to design the task-based material is that can we edit the authentic material or we keep exactly the same? So how we can
Okay.
how much authenticity that we keep for
Yeah.
materials?
Okay, so Chung, I don't know if you remember in the test design workshop and also in the curriculum workshop. So the stance we've taken at Chicago is it's not that some material is some authentic, precious, holy thing that you can't change. We talk about it in terms of the student interaction with it. So there's a student, it should feel, I think the word we like to use is genuine. Okay, so I think, so like in Trank's question, a newscast made in the Southern dialect might feel weird because because it's not happening, right? But interviewing someone's grandmother or aunt about their experiences as an immigrant or their last memories in Vietnam or whatever it is, that's real. Now you might get that recording and need to edit it. That's not going to ruin its authenticity because another part of the genuineness is that it fits your pedagogical need. So if you have a material you find out, that's quote unquote authentic, but it's going to be too long or too complex, or you can pull out a middle paragraph because you don't need it. That's okay because your goal is for it to work pedagogically. And again, that's where you're the boss. And you are the one that can make that decision. The flip side of that is like seeing dialogues in every single textbook. When do we ever actually hear or read dialogues? They're the most unauthentic thing in the world, right? So thinking about this authentic, genuine interaction, we want our learners interacting with the text or with an input in a way that feels real, right? That's more what it's about. It's not about not being able to touch an original piece of input, reading, video, whatever it might be.
Yeah. Okay, so I think thank you so much. We have run out of time. It's now 9:30 p.m. And thank you so much again, KSP, for wonderful
You're welcome.
presentation about the curriculum and task-based. And before, thank you every attendance participant that you have spent time with us for the task-based. And we also want to remind you that we have 2 more workshops for the next month. Is on June 26th with Laura Guzinski with the task sequencing in action on June 26th. And on July 25th, we have the Hitomi Masuhara for the attack-driven task-based approach to material development. And then we will follow up the email for you more information to sign up for this event. And last but not least, please, before you go, please give your feedback to our workshop series by the link that my colleague Anne put in the chat. Okay, so thank you so much, Kathy, again, and have a good night. And
You're
thank you,
welcome.
everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Yeah,
Cảm ơn các chị ạ.
everyone can.
Thank you.
Okay, just spend like just 2 minutes to do the feedback form for us.
Thank you.
Em điền rồi nha.
Thank you,
Thank
Trang.
you, Trang.
Chúc các chị ngủ ngon. Bây giờ em là 4 giờ sáng em chào các chị.
Okay. Rồi Trang đi ngủ đi, muộn quá chứ không? Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.